Yeah, let me just, again, I'll show the flyer here for my new book, just coming out. We Hold These Truths, The Hope of Monetary Reform, and if any of the viewers want to order it, go to www.tendrilpress.com, which is the website for my publisher, and you can log on, you can buy the book, and get in on the first print run, which is coming out in the next couple of weeks. So that's a brand new book on monetary reform, and it's available now. I also want to mention the book that I wrote and published within the first month of my retirement from the federal government. It was my book on the Challenger disaster, because I worked in NASA at the time of the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster in 1986. I waited over 20 years to come out with the insider story of the Challenger disaster from inside NASA. It's called Challenger Revealed, an insider's account of how the Reagan administration caused the greatest tragedy of the space age. This is available in bookstores, on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, and my website that describes the Challenger book is www.richardccook.com, so you can look at that too. Well, I was really pleased when George and Charlotte invited me to speak today, because this is a very important meeting that's taking place in Washington today, the meeting of the G20, the G20 Economic Summit. But I don't think we should expect too much from this summit as far as the United States and our economic dilemma is concerned. And so that's why I've titled my talk, The G20 Economic Summit Won't Change This Poopy Diaper. So, what is the poopy diaper that needs to be changed? The G20 is meeting today in Washington, D.C. to discuss the world financial crisis, its causes, and what they can do about it. The stated objectives, and of course objectives of any meeting like this depends on what article you read and who you talk to, but what they seem to be saying is that we want to stabilize the world financial system, and the Europeans are talking about reducing the speculation in the world financial markets that certainly has been one of the factors that has brought about this breakdown that we are witnessing. They want to make financial transactions more transparent, more efficient, and more international in scope, because the international system is not working very well. Particularly because when you realize the enormous quantity of financial transactions that are really just currency exchanges within the currency markets, and those are rife with speculation and abuse. So there certainly is a hope that the currency markets are going to be looked at. But, and this is very important from my perspective, this conference is also a revolt by the nations of the world against the over-reliance on the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. And what we are likely to see over time is some kind of a new multi-currency regime that will include the euro and one or more of the Asian currencies as well as reserve currencies. We're going to see this play out over the next probably several years. But none of this will address what I view and other monetary reformers view as the real causes of why the world is heading into a global recession. This will not stop the global recession, and it will not address why the U.S. economy in particular is in such dire straits. The real problem from the point of view of monetary reform is that the world is locked into a debt-based financial system. That's debt, D-E-B-T, run by the world's banks, where the only way currency can be entered into circulation any longer is through bank lending. Now, it wasn't always this way, and I'm going to point out why. But this is the system that we have today, particularly in the Western nations who work under a central banking system. This has been the problem since the creation of the Federal Reserve System in the U.S. in 1913. And I know that very many of the people who listen to George's and Charlotte's broadcasts know that the financial system is in such a terrible situation today, in part at least because of the Federal Reserve System and how that works. It was in 1913 when the Federal Reserve System was implemented that the U.S. monetary system was privatized. We've heard a lot about privatization, particularly in the last generation, since the 1980s. But it's essential to realize that the first and the biggest privatization took place with the monetary system in 1913. The case is the same in other Western nations which have central banks, and even in a country like Great Britain, where the Bank of England, and the Bank of England is the granddaddy of all the central banks, having been founded in 1694, even where the central bank is nationalized, as is the case with the Bank of England, money is still entered into circulation through the private banking system. So from that point of view, it remains a private banking system and a privatized monetary system, even if the institution of the central bank is nationalized. The creation of the Federal Reserve System, if you look at history, marked the start of a century of world war. Is that a coincidence? Indeed, I think if you look dispassionately at history, particularly of the last century, you can see how the central banking system encourages wars and lives off of them, because it is war and the threat of war that is most profitable to a system where the more money governments borrow, the more profits the bank makes. That is not a coincidence. It's the way the system was designed, because the Bank of England was created in 1694 largely to finance the wars that created the British Empire. We now have the Federal Reserve System, which has financed the wars that have created the U.S. empire. It all started with World War I, which was largely financed by the British, French, and the U.S. banks. Events have continued in that vein through today, where the nations of the world are armed to the teeth with weapons of mass destruction, and global finance capitalism continues to increase its control everywhere throughout the world to the detriment of workers, national economies, and the environment in all nations. We are now seeing, with the financial crisis, both in the U.S. and in Europe, levels of government borrowing that have not been seen since World War II, with the aim of recapitalizing a financial system that has failed. And of course, this recapitalization is overflowing now into industry, insurance companies, other parts of the global economy. But all this government borrowing does is defer the bill to future generations who have to pay the enormous compounded interest that this borrowing entails. In the 2009 federal budget, interest on the national debt, only interest, is now over $500 billion a year. And this is why many people believe, and you can read it throughout the press, believe the United States may even be in danger of defaulting on its gigantic national debt sometime in 2009. Now, there's a kind of default that's not named a default, and that is a hyperinflation. Because through a hyperinflation, the government gets to pay down its debt with cheaper dollars. So they're really two sides of the same coin. We're already seeing what is possibly the beginning of a hyperinflation that may actually lead to a default. Meanwhile, as we know, the failed financial system is dragging down the world's producing economy with it due to the shortage of credit. And a few improvements will not change that situation. What has happened in the recent weeks has really been a collapse of what is called in economics consumer demand. Robert Wright, former Secretary of Labor, had a good article on Truth Out this past week talking about specifically the collapse of consumer demand, and he's right. In other words, consumers who are maxed out on their credit no longer can borrow enough money to keep the wheels of the economy that depends on them to turn. But the real reason that consumers must constantly borrow for consumption should be obvious. It is simply that earnings are not sufficient for people to buy what they need to live. This is why in the U.S. there has been an outcry, including with the Obama campaign, for new government job creation programs. The 5 million jobs for green energy, for example. Every day there is another proposal by progressives for new government spending, which of course will have to be financed by even more government debt. One commentator yesterday, a progressive commentator, said, yeah, we may have trillion-dollar budget deficits the next couple of years, and that's certainly where it's headed. But this, too, is only another layer on the already flimsy debt pyramid that we are all familiar with. So, question is, when are we going to learn how to introduce purchasing power without debt? How did we ever come to believe that the only way to create money, which is purchasing power in the consumer economy, is through a bank inventing it out of thin air, to use the phrase of John Maynard Keynes, who, of course, is considered the greatest economist of the past century. In the past few weeks, we have had quite a number of Nobel Prize-winning economists chip in with their suggestions of what to do. There was an article the other day on MSN, 5 Nobel Prize-winning economists tell you what they should do to fix the economy. None of them, not a single one, not Stiglitz, not Krugman, who just won the prize, not one of them has addressed the obvious question of what are the alternatives to bankers' debt-based currency. Not a single one. Now, if we look at history, we see other ways that governments have used their powers to create money. Indeed, until the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the United States was kind of a laboratory of alternative methods of money creation. I'm not going to go through the entire history of currency, although when I was in the Carter White House, I read a really great book on that subject, and one of the topics was the Yap Island stone money, you know, the big stone wheels, where if you buy something, you roll that wheel down to your neighbor's hut. It worked. There have been many, many ways of introducing currency throughout history without a bank. The United States did not have a commercial bank until 1779. And 2 centuries of economic growth without it. If we go back into colonial days, the American colonies used a variety of means to introduce money into circulation, so I want to mention a few of those, just to start the wheels turning about other ways to look at this. In Virginia, plantation owners received tobacco certificates when they deposited their product at public warehouses. These certificates, or tobacco receipts, were then currency that circulated in the Virginia economy. In Pennsylvania, the government ran a land bank which paid cash to landowners for liens on property. The interest paid that the government received from these liens paid for the costs of the state government, or the colonial government, in Pennsylvania with no taxation of citizens. So a real currency can work through the taxation system as well. In Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere, governments simply spent paper money directly into circulation. If the state legislature or its agency needed to buy something, they would print and spend the money. Why was it valuable? It was valuable because the state or the colony would then take it back in payment of land taxes. So it became a legal tender by virtue of its acceptability for tax payment. Other forms of currency included Spanish dollars, metallic coinage. Indian wampum was a circulating currency in parts of the American colonies, and simply IOUs. An IOU was monetized. If the person were reliable, had a business, had an income flow, it was money. And, of course, there was also a very flourishing barter trade, particularly in agricultural commodities. The system worked. We say, oh, that was 200 years ago, it was primitive, but it was still the most flourishing economy on the planet at that time. The prosperity of the American colonies was baffling to the English. When asked why, Benjamin Franklin told them it was because of colonial scrip, i.e., circulating paper money within the colonies. And he wrote a famous treatise on that in 1729. What did the British do? In 1764, they passed the Currency Act outlawing colonial paper scrip. The result was an economic depression. That was the underlying cause of the Revolutionary War. The economic depression that resulted from the Currency Act of 1764. And we know that's the case because one of the first things the Continental Congress did when they began to meet in 1775 in Philadelphia, was they issued the famous continental currency. And of course, the scholars have given that continental currency a bad name because they say, well, it inflated, not worth a continental. They do not tell you, but it's been documented by objective historians, the real reason for the inflation of the continental currency was that it was counterfeited by the British on ships that were in New York Harbor. And they would then counterfeit this money. They would take it into coffee houses in New York City and give it away for their agents to take around the countryside to use as a weapon of war. And currency manipulation today is still a weapon of war. And that was why the continental currency inflated, but it still kept the American army in the field for 3 years until we were able to get the loans from France to finance the rest of the war. Now, once the United States became independent, a United States Mint was set up. And this was a very, very important institution because this was not government-issued currency. Individuals could bring in gold or silver and have it stamped into coinage at no charge. New discoveries, as with the California and Yukon gold rushes in the 19th century, as well as better methods of extraction of gold from gold ore, resulted in economic booms in the United States and in other countries. Because the fact that there was now money in circulation, an additional increment of money, called production forth and gave people confidence they could make money through producing more goods and services. From that time until coinage lost its value, after the Federal Reserve System was established, and it was the post-World War I inflation engendered by Federal Reserve policies that reduced the value of coinage and removed it as a major component of the U.S. monetary system. But until then, precious metals were a major part of the U.S. monetary system that included not just the coinage, but also gold and silver certificates issued by the U.S. Treasury during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, backed by gold and silver held by the government. So precious metals were a key part of the government's monetary supply, and as we all know, they are no longer playing that role. In 1791 and again in 1816, Congress passed legislation for the first and second banks of the United States. These banks were clones of the Bank of England, and the purposes were to fasten on the U.S. the same type of debt-based monetary system that was the driving force for the British Empire. Presidents Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Andrew Jackson, and Martin Van Buren were among those who saw these banks as a Trojan horse for financier tyranny. And even then, the financier cabal, as you might call it, was not just our bankers in New York, but also the European bankers in London and the European continent. In fact, the split between pro and anti-bank forces, when you do the research, was the origin of the two-party system within the United States. That is why we have a two-party system. The Federalists, followed by the Whigs and the Republicans, were the pro-bank party. The Democrats, beginning with Jefferson, were the anti-bank party and have remained so, if you really look at the history, until today. When Jefferson became president in 1800, and it was called the Civic Revolution of 1800, such an event, and it was a revolution against the growing power of the banks and the financiers. Jefferson refused to borrow from the bank, and he balanced the federal budget for 8 consecutive years. It's never been done since. How? By cutting military expenditures. Andrew Jackson took similar action in 1833 when he withdrew federal funds from the bank and he paid off the entire national debt. The U.S. government owed nothing. It was recognized back then, and even a few people have an inkling today, the fiscal responsibility is an effective means for keeping the government out of control of the banks and their political friends. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, President Abraham Lincoln, though a Republican, he was still a patriot. He refused to borrow from the banks. The banks wanted interest on the order of 30% for war loans. Instead, Lincoln financed the war through income and excise taxes, the sale of war bonds directly to citizens, and issuance of the famous greenbacks. This came about in 1862 when Congress authorized the government to spend $450 million in paper greenbacks directly into circulation. Congress also introduced tangible value into the economy during the Civil War by giving away huge amounts of public land to the railroads and to citizens under the Homestead Act, injecting economic power into the economy. During the late 19th century, ordinary citizens were not so stunningly ignorant of the politics of money as they are today. People recognized the greenbacks for having saved the Union. And again, greenbacks were spent into circulation. They were backed by gold. Later on, you could redeem your greenbacks if you wanted to. Nobody did because they were well printed, hard to counterfeit. But the government needed something. They paid it in greenbacks. A revolutionary idea. So simple and yet very elegant, and it worked. They didn't have to borrow the money. They didn't have to tax people for that $450 million. They just spent the money, and then the money, through ordinary commerce, circulated throughout the economy. In fact, the greenbacks were viewed so positively that a greenback party was formed that elected representatives to Congress and even ran candidates for president in the post-Civil War era. Greenbacks remained in circulation. Even people who know about greenbacks say, well, that was just for the Civil War. Not true. As late as 1900, according to an eminent monetary historian, whose book I've read about this, still made up a third of the nation's circulating monetary supply, along with coinage, gold and silver certificates, and national bank notes. Also, many other business entities, including the company stores owned by mining companies, which, of course, we laugh at today, but they issued their own paper script that became part of the circulating currency. For example, when I was researching this, in a pamphlet on monetary reform that I found in the University of Maryland Library, written by the American poet Ezra Pound, who was an expert on monetary history. He wrote this in the 1930s. In this pamphlet, there was an illustration of paper money his grandfather issued from a lumber yard the family owned in Michigan in the late 1800s. It was backed by board feet of lumber, payable on demand. And it circulated in that community as part of their money supply. And if you really, really wanted to redeem it and find out if it was good, you could take it to Ezra Pound's grandfather's lumber yard and pick up the wood. Of course, barter trade continued, and barter still exists on a substantial scale today among industrial firms who don't really want to go to the banks themselves whenever they need something. Barter is flourishing today. among industrial companies. They don't tell you about it, but it is. But the bankers knew about all this, and they were on the move. In 1863 and 1864, and remember, the Republicans were now in power. By and large, they were a pro-bank party. They passed the National Banking Acts, which drove the extensive system of state-chartered banks, including some banks that were owned by state governments. You know, we talk about socialism today. There were banks in the U.S. before the Civil War owned by state governments who lent at low rates of interest for commerce and business in their states. But this legislation, maneuvered by the biggest banks, particularly the ones out of New York, drove those banks out of existence. By the early 1900s, the power of the banks had coalesced under the New York Banking Trust, led by J.P. Morgan and the Rockefeller financial interests. Those are the two parties who ran the money trust and who still run it today. J.P. Morgan Chase is the descendant of the J.P. Morgan banking empire, merged with the Chase Manhattan Bank, which is the Rockefeller banking empire. So when you read something like, for example, J.P. Morgan Chase just bought Washington Mutual for $1.9 billion and got assets of over $300 billion, now you know who did that and where they came from. The bankers struck in 1913, just before the Christmas recess, when many congressmen had already left Washington for the holidays. The Federal Reserve Act was actually written, as you know, if you've read Eustace Mullen or the other really good books that are out now in the Federal Reserve. Many congressmen had left Washington for the holidays. The bankers from Europe who wrote the legislation were, of course, allied with the Rothschild interests, another big name in banking history. Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr., who was father of Charles Lindbergh Jr., the aviator, was a congressman from Minnesota. Here's what he called the Federal Reserve Act: the legislative crime of the ages. It was signed by Woodrow Wilson, the president, who later said that by signing the Federal Reserve Act, he had, quote, unwittingly ruined my nation, unquote. But the deed was done. The Federal Reserve System created the first major financial bubble through World War I spending, followed by a depression, and then they created and burst the stock market bubble, whose collapse began the Great Depression in 1929. President Franklin D. Roosevelt took over credit creation through low-cost government lending in the 1930s. That's why we had the New Deal. But he had to use World War II to achieve full employment, because by then the government was totally locked into the Keynesian tax and borrow credo of public finance. He never could get rid of borrowing money for government expenditures, even though he did it at low cost. The bankers began their comeback in the 1950s, and they consolidated their power in the 1970s under the heading of a word we've all heard called monetarism, which is the philosophy of trying to control the economy through raising and lowering of interest rates. This travesty, which is really institutionalized usury, is as familiar to us today as the water a fish swims in. We don't even notice it. And yet it's in the newspapers every day. Will the Fed raise interest rates? Will it lower interest rates? This is the system that has ruined the world. Ever since the 1970s, every period of economic growth in the U.S. has been a bank-created bubble followed by a crash and a recession. No exceptions. We had the inflation of the 1970s created by the government-induced oil price shocks, followed by the Paul Volcker crash of 1979 to 83, when the Federal Reserve raised interest rates above 20% and caused the biggest downturn since the Great Depression. And Volcker today is a key advisor to President-elect Obama. During the later Reagan years, we had the merger-acquisition bubble, followed by the recession that brought Bill Clinton to office in 1992. Then we had the dot-com bubble of the mid to late 1990s that ended with the crash of 2000, 2001. This was a bubble engineered by Secretary of the Treasury Rubin. Next, instead of rebuilding an economy that had been devastated by the export of our best manufacturing jobs to China and other cheap labor countries, the Federal Reserve under Chairman Alan Greenspan, with assistance from the George W. Bush administration, created the biggest bubble economy in history, with the housing, commercial real estate, equity, hedge fund, derivatives, and commodities bubbles all blowing up at the same time and leaving us in the mess that we are in today. Of course, in the face of so many disasters, the credit markets have imploded, and governments don't know what to do except recapitalize and restructure those markets, but without taking action to address the deep systemic problems within the producing economy. Yes, Wall Street has killed Main Street, and no one has come up with an answer except suggestions for some New Deal type programs in an environment that is much worse than in the 1930s. For one thing, most of what we consume today is produced abroad. For another, family farming has been ruined. In a pinch, our nation could no longer even feed itself. But the amazing thing is how easy it would be to salvage the situation if the government took the simple step of treating credit as what it really is. It's a public utility, like clean air, water, or electricity. It is not the private property of the banking system. We know this because every bank operates under a public charter. Every bank is given permission by our government to do what it does. Our government can't run and hide. The Constitution gives Congress, the people's representative government, authority to regulate interstate commerce, and it also gives Congress the right and responsibility to control the monetary system. This is what they privatized in 1913. So why doesn't Congress do what they're supposed to do? Why does Congress sit passively and stare when Federal Reserve chairmen such as Alan Greenspan or Ben Bernanke sit before them and mumble about markets and interest rates and inflation and the rest of a made-up system whose main result is to constantly funnel the wealth of the economy upwards into the hands of the financial elite? In my writings, I have advocated several measures Congress could take immediately to remedy the catastrophe that we are now facing. 1. Congress could authorize direct expenditure of government funds for legitimate public expenses, as was done with the Civil War-era greenbacks. Contrary to bankers' propaganda, the greenbacks were not inflationary then and would not be inflationary now because they would be backed by tangible economic production of goods and services. That's what the backing of the monetary supply should be. What has been inflationary has been the debt-based currency, which, since it was introduced in 1913, has caused the U.S. dollar to lose 95% of its value. Bank currency is the cause of inflation because it's built into the price of everything that is produced. Greenback-type spending is contained in the proposed American Monetary Act developed by the American Monetary Institute, to which I contributed, and it is now one of the platform planks of Dennis Kucinich, or at least was in his run for Congress. 2, Congress could authorize a national infrastructure bank that would be self-capitalized and would lend money into existence to state and local governments at 0% interest. Legislation for such a bank has been introduced again by Congressman Dennis Kucinich. 3, Congress could authorize dividend payments to citizens as advocated by the social credit movement. It was founded by Major C.H. Douglas of Great Britain decades ago as a means of monetizing the net appreciation of the producing economy. I cover the theory of this thoroughly in my articles and in my book. Dividends exceeding $1,000 a month could be issued from a national dividend account without recourse to taxation or borrowing. Such a concept is related to the Alaska Permanent Fund, which paid over $3,200 to each state resident in 2008. And that wasn't Sarah Palin's program. She implemented it, but it had been in part of the Alaska Constitution since the 1970s. It's also related to the concept of a basic income guarantee that was advocated by proponents of the negative income tax in years past. Number 4, Congress could utilize dividend payments once they were spent, and they could possibly be spent in the form of vouchers, which I've also written about, for the necessities of life like food and housing, to capitalize a new network of community savings banks that would provide low-cost credit to home purchasers, students, small business people, and local farms. A nationwide system of these types of community savings banks could revolutionize economics at the grassroots level in this country. I worked in the U.S. Treasury Department for 21 years, and I learned firsthand, and I also taught courses on, the history and operations of public finance in the United States. I have seen the disastrous results of the debt-based financial system. And believe me, people from Treasury sit around and we watch the national debt clock go up and up and up. And we watch the tax cuts for the rich. And we watch the trillions being spent on the war, and we just shake our heads. What are these people thinking? This system has driven our nation, government, and people to the point of bankruptcy. I have also seen how these simple measures of monetary reform would be easy to implement. Treasury could do it today. And it would begin to turn the situation around within a matter of weeks or months. I mean, look what that tiny little economic stimulus tax rebate did. It kept the economy out of recession in the second quarter, $300, $600, $900 a person. Even that can do tremendous good. It was an emergency measure to keep the economy from crashing totally before the election. But that was just the beginning of what should be done on the dividend side of government financing. But all it takes is political will and a determination to challenge the death grip that the international financial elite has had on our economy for a century. And we know who it is in this country who is part of that international financial elite. They're the ones who are behind the trillion-dollar bailouts today. We can be quite certain that these vital issues will not be addressed by the summit of the G20 meeting in Washington today, unless I'm very badly mistaken. If anything, these meetings are likely to render the grip of private finance on the peoples of the world even tighter than before. But sooner or later, change must come. For the immediate future, people could fight back by a few simple measures, doing everything possible to get out of debt. Once you're in debt, they've got you. Converting cash reserves to tangible holdings, because obviously the markets are not made for the people. And even to start their own local currency and barter systems. But for real long-term change, a monetary revolution along the lines that you've heard here today is required. Let me just mention again, these and many other ideas are in my new book. It's called We Hold These Truths, The Hope of Monetary Reform. It's published by Tendril Press, which is a press out of Colorado. It's available now. If you go online, go to www.tendrilpress.com. You can order the book. It retails for $19.95, and you can get in on the first print run, which is going to come out in the next couple of weeks. So I really am very grateful to George and to Charlotte and to your audience for hearing me out today. I think, as you can probably tell, that there are no more important issues facing our country today, certainly than the economic ones, but behind that, the cause of the economic problems is something that people really need to look at in daily life, in public life, and that is the failed monetary system that we're dealing with. So thank you.